It was supposed to be a simple night out. One of those rare evenings when we could unwind, just the two of us, away from the usual stress and noise of life. But looking back now, I realized that I had been the only one looking forward to it. My husband, James, had been distant, his eyes glazed over in a way that seemed so familiar and yet so hurtful. I brushed it off as him having an off day, convincing myself that a nice dinner and some time together would be the perfect antidote to whatever was weighing on him. We decided to go to a cozy little restaurant, tucked away in a quiet part of town. It was the kind of place I thought would help us reconnect. Intimate, with warm lighting and the quiet hum of soft music in the background. We'd been there only a few times before, but each visit had been filled with laughter, whispers, and fleeting glances that made me feel cherished. But tonight, the ambiance seemed lost on him. As we waited for our food, I tried to pull him into conversation, reminiscing about our favorite memories. But his responses were short, almost absent. I could see his gaze drifting around the room, and I felt my heart sink. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, like there was a barrier between us that I didn't know how to break. But I held my tongue, telling myself not to ruin the evening with questions or doubts. Then, in an instant, the evening changed. The quiet clinking of cutlery and the soft murmur of conversation were shattered by a loud, demanding voice. A man at the door, clad in dark clothes, was shouting, waving something shiny, something cold and metallic. It took me a second to process that it was a gun. Fear washed over me, icy and paralyzing, as the realization hit. We were being robbed. The man ordered everyone to stay put, his voice hard and threatening. Panic spread like wildfire, and I felt my heart race as I looked at James, instinctively reaching for his hand. But when I looked over, I froze. James wasn't looking at me. Instead, his eyes were fixed across the room, his body tense, his jaw clenched. And then I saw her. His ex, a woman whose name I'd rather not even utter, sitting just a few tables away. The realization struck me like a blow. She was there, and he knew it. His whole demeanor shifted. His focus, his attention, all of it was on her. I felt a chill run through me as I watched him. A man I thought I knew, a man I believed would protect me, become someone I didn't recognize. The robber's voice was growing louder, more insistent, as he moved from table to table, collecting wallets, jewelry, anything of value. People were frozen in fear, too terrified to resist. I was trembling, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, but the only one that mattered was simple. I needed James. I needed him to be there for me, to help me feel safe. But when I looked back at him, he was already gone, physically present, but emotionally, his focus was entirely elsewhere. And then, before I could even register what was happening, James rose from his seat and moved toward her. I watched, rooted to the spot, as he walked away from me, as though I didn't even exist, and positioned himself between her and the robber. He shielded her with his body, whispering reassurances to her, his hands gently on her shoulders. In that moment, it felt like the world around me faded into silence. The sounds of fear and panic dimmed, replaced by the deafening roar of betrayal in my mind. My husband had left me, in the most literal and devastating way possible. He had chosen her, his ex, over me. And as the robber's gaze swept over the room, I was left standing alone, vulnerable, unprotected, with nothing but the hollow ache of abandonment. As I stood there, frozen and betrayed in the middle of that restaurant, the weight of countless memories bore down on me. I had been nothing but devoted to James, always putting our relationship and him before myself. But now, as I watched him choose someone else in my time of need, each memory felt like a thorn, piercing deeper and deeper into my heart. It hadn't always been this way, or so I'd thought. When James and I first met, he was attentive, affectionate, and warm. He had this way of making me feel seen, like I was the only person in the world. I clung to those memories now, searching for the version of him I'd fallen in love with, the version I had believed in. But over the years, something shifted. Subtly at first, just small, almost unnoticeable changes in how he looked at me or how often he made time for us. I could see now that each of those moments had been warning signs, signals of a distance growing between us. But back then, I had ignored them, chalking them up to the stresses of life, of work, of routine. I told myself it was normal for things to settle down after the honeymoon phase, that all couples went through ups and downs. And so I adjusted. I became the one who constantly tried to bridge the gap, who worked to keep the spark alive. I remember planning little surprises, making his favorite dinners, going out of my way to do things that would make him smile. And every time I'd catch him looking away, lost in thought or distracted, I'd convince myself it was just a phase. There were moments when I saw glimpses of that man I once knew. They were fleeting, but I held on to them, letting them fuel my belief that our love was strong, that he just needed time. I buried my own needs, my own desires, believing that if I just loved him enough, if I showed him patience and understanding, he would come back to me fully. But the truth, as painful as it was to admit, was that I was constantly compromising myself. I didn't realize it then, but I was shrinking, bit by bit, losing parts of myself in the process of trying to keep him happy. I'd stopped seeing my own friends as often, let go of hobbies that had once brought me joy, and rearranged my life around him. All because I thought that's what love required. One memory in particular cut through me like a blade as I stood there, watching him with his ex. A few years ago, James had asked me to attend an event with him, one that meant a lot to his career. I'd spent hours preparing, choosing the perfect outfit, rehearsing conversations in my mind, all to make sure I could support him in the best way possible. But when we arrived, his attention had drifted almost immediately. He introduced me to his colleagues, sure, but then he spent the rest of the evening networking, leaving me to fend for myself in a room full of strangers. I remembered standing by the bar, clutching my drink, feeling invisible, as he laughed and chatted with others, forgetting I was even there. I had felt so small, so unimportant, like I was merely an accessory, there to fill a role rather than to be seen and appreciated. But even then, I'd convinced myself it was okay, that it was a one-off, that he was just focused on his career. I made excuses for him, over and over, choosing to believe that he cared, even when his actions told me otherwise. And now, with everything crashing down around me, I couldn't help but wonder how much of my life I'd spent making those excuses. How many times had I told myself that my needs were less important, that his happiness mattered more? I had put him on a pedestal, convincing myself that my own happiness was tied to his, that my role was to support and nurture, even at the expense of my own well-being. As I stood alone in that restaurant, watching him protect her, memories flooded back to me. Moments I'd dismissed, excuses I'd made, sacrifices I'd willingly given. It was as if the blinders I'd worn for years were suddenly ripped off, forcing me to see the reality I had been so desperate to ignore. All those years of putting him first, of bending over backward to accommodate his needs, seemed meaningless in that moment. Because when it mattered, when I needed him the most, he wasn't there. The irony was almost laughable. I had poured everything into our relationship, believing that love meant sacrifice, that my worth came from being the devoted partner who put her husband first. And now, as he shielded his ex from danger while leaving me vulnerable and alone, I realized just how little he valued the love I'd given so freely. A painful clarity washed over me, filling the empty spaces where doubt and denial had once lingered. I saw now that I had been clinging to an illusion, to a fantasy of what I wanted us to be, rather than the reality of who he was. And the bitter truth was that he had been showing me who he truly was all along. I just hadn't wanted to see it. As the robbery unfolded around me, I felt a strange calm settle over my heart, an emptiness that was no longer filled with hope or longing. Instead, it was replaced by a hollow ache, a sadness that seemed endless. For the first time, I allowed myself to see the truth, that I had been invisible to the one person I'd given everything to. And no amount of love, no amount of sacrifice could change that. The days that followed the robbery were a blur, each one blending into the next in a haze of confusion and pain. The sounds, the images, and the crushing feelings from that night replayed endlessly in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that restaurant, staring at James as he protected her, his ex, while I was left to fend for myself. I tried to reason with myself to understand how this could have happened. Was it instinct? Had he simply acted without thinking, driven by some primal urge to protect? But every excuse I tried to make for him felt like a lie, a flimsy shield I was holding up against the brutal truth that he had chosen someone else over me, someone he had left behind long ago. Or so I had thought. When I finally confronted him, I expected some acknowledgement of my pain, some shred of remorse or guilt. I thought he would see how much he'd hurt me, that he would fall over himself apologizing, begging for forgiveness. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw none of that. Instead, he looked away, almost embarrassed, as if the whole situation were some minor inconvenience, rather than the breaking point of our marriage. I panicked, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know what I was doing. He stumbled over his words, trying to explain, but each attempt only deepened the wound. He told me that when he saw her, something in him had clicked, that he felt compelled to protect her, to make sure she was safe. I listened in silence, feeling a cold, numb sensation wash over me. It was as if I were listening to a stranger, someone who had nothing to do with the life we had built together. "Did you even think of me?" I asked, my voice trembling, barely able to contain the mix of anger and devastation that had been building inside me since that night. "For 1 second, did you think about what leaving me alone like that would do to me?" He looked away, unable to meet my gaze, and in that moment I felt a hollow emptiness settle in my chest. His silence was all the answer I needed. I had spent years sacrificing for him, making him my priority, my purpose, and when it mattered most, when I needed him, he couldn't even look me in the eye. Each word he spoke felt hollow, devoid of any real meaning. He told me he was sorry, that he didn't intend to hurt me, that he hadn't thought about what he was doing. But his words were as empty as I felt inside. I realized then that he wasn't apologizing because he regretted what he had done. He was apologizing because he'd been caught, because he knew there was no way to avoid the reality of what he had done. I thought about all the years I'd spent putting him first, about the countless times I'd overlooked my own needs for the sake of our relationship. I had believed that love meant sacrifice, that being a good partner meant supporting him even when he didn't deserve it. But now, standing in front of him, I saw the truth. I had been giving and giving, pouring everything I had into someone who would never give me the same in return. The silence between us grew heavy, each passing second a reminder of the chasm that had opened up between us. I searched his face, looking for any sign of the man I thought I knew, the man I had built my life around. But all I saw was a stranger, someone who had betrayed me in a way I could never have imagined. In that moment, a part of me broke, a part that I knew I would never get back. I had spent so long convincing myself that he was my partner, my protector, the person who would always stand by my side. But now, I saw him for what he truly was, someone who had never truly valued me, someone who had always held a piece of himself back, reserved for someone else. As he reached for my hand, I pulled away, feeling a wave of cold detachment wash over me. I no longer wanted his touch, his comfort, or his empty words. All I felt was a sense of loss, a deep, aching grief for the life I thought we had, for the person I had believed him to be. "I can't do this," I whispered, more to myself than to him. The words felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else, someone stronger, someone who had finally had enough. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and desperation. But I could see that even now, he didn't fully understand the damage he had done. He didn't understand that this wasn't something that could be mended with apologies or explanations. This was a fracture, a rift so deep that it had shattered the foundation of our relationship. I turned away, feeling the weight of his gaze on my back as I walked out of the room. For the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of relief, a freedom that was both terrifying and exhilarating. I was stepping into the unknown, leaving behind the man I had once loved, the life I had once believed in. And though the path ahead was uncertain, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I could no longer live in the shadow of someone else's choices. In the days that followed our confrontation, a strange calm settled over me. It was a quiet, heavy kind of calm. The kind that comes after a storm, when everything around you feels still, even though the wreckage remains. I felt like I was in a daze, going through the motions of daily life while my mind replayed that night and his betrayal over and over again. For so long, I had defined myself by my relationship with James. I had built my world around him, convinced that his happiness was my purpose, that my value was somehow tied to the role I played in his life. But now, I was beginning to see the truth, that I had been living in his shadow, sacrificing parts of myself to fit into a life that was never truly mine. One evening, as I sat alone in our quiet, empty house, I found myself reflecting on the person I had been before him. I remembered a time when I had dreams and goals of my own, passions that had nothing to do with him or his needs. Somewhere along the way, I had let those parts of myself slip away, believing that love meant putting him first. But now, with nothing left to cling to, I realized that it was time to rediscover who I was, apart from him. That realization was my turning point, a moment of clarity that cut through the fog of betrayal and grief. I didn't have to keep living like this, chained to a relationship that had left me empty and broken. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to think about what I wanted, what I needed. And the answer was simple: I needed to find myself again. With a deep breath, I began to take small steps toward reclaiming my life. I started with the things I had once loved, the hobbies and interests that had brought me joy before I had abandoned them for the sake of our relationship. I dusted off an old canvas, one that had been tucked away in the attic for years, and started painting again. At first, my strokes were hesitant, unsure, but as the colors filled the canvas, I felt a spark, a sense of purpose that had been buried beneath layers of compromise and self-sacrifice. Painting became my escape, a way to express all the emotions I couldn't put into words. Each brushstroke was a release, a small rebellion against the part of me that had once believed my worth was tied to someone else's love. I poured my hurt, my anger, and my sadness onto that canvas, letting the colors bleed and blend, creating something raw and honest, something that was entirely mine. And it wasn't just painting. I started reconnecting with old friends, people I had drifted away from over the years. They welcomed me back with open arms, their warmth and laughter reminding me of a time when I had been happy, independent, and free. I found comfort in their company, in the memories we shared, and in the new moments we were creating together. As I spent more time with people who truly valued me, I began to see just how much I had been missing. I had allowed myself to become isolated, trapped in a relationship that had slowly chipped away at my sense of self. But now, I was reclaiming those pieces, putting myself back together, bit by bit. There were moments when the pain still surfaced, when memories of that night and his betrayal would creep into my mind, unbidden. But each time, I reminded myself that I was moving forward, that I was no longer the woman who would sacrifice herself for someone who didn't see her worth. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, I stood in front of the mirror, looking at my reflection. I hardly recognized the woman staring back at me. There was a strength in her eyes, a resilience that had been forged through heartbreak and betrayal. I saw the faint traces of a smile, a glimmer of hope, a sense of freedom that felt both unfamiliar and exhilarating. In that moment, I made a promise to myself. I promised that I would never again let anyone define my worth, that I would no longer allow my happiness to be tied to someone else's choices. I was done waiting for someone to see my value. I was done sacrificing my dreams, my passions, and my identity for the sake of a relationship that had never truly honored me. This was my turning point, the moment when I chose to stand up for myself, to reclaim the parts of me that I had lost. It wasn't easy, and I knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges and moments of doubt. But I was ready. For the first time, I was living for myself, making choices that were driven by my own needs, my own desires, and my own sense of worth. And as I took that first step toward independence, I felt a sense of liberation, a freedom that filled every corner of my heart. This was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter that I would write on my own terms, a chapter that was finally truly mine. Weeks passed, and with each day, I felt a little stronger, a little more certain of the path I was forging for myself. The memories of James, his betrayal, and that night in the restaurant were still there, lingering like faint bruises. But they no longer held power over me. I was finding my voice again, discovering that I could stand tall on my own, without needing validation or approval from anyone else. One afternoon, as I was finishing a painting in my small studio space, I received an invitation to a gathering. It was from a mutual friend of James and mine, someone who had been close to us as a couple, and who in the aftermath of everything had remained supportive, offering kind words and understanding. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't sure if I was ready to face the people who had known me as part of a pair, people who still saw me as his wife. But something inside me stirred, a quiet, persistent voice that reminded me of the promise I had made to myself, the vow to no longer live in his shadow. This gathering was more than just an invitation. It was an opportunity, a chance to show myself and everyone else that I was no longer defined by the hurt he had caused. I was my own person, someone who had fought through the darkness and come out stronger on the other side. So I decided to go. The gathering was held in a cozy, candle-lit venue, the kind of place where laughter echoed off the walls and conversations flowed as easily as the drinks. As I walked in, I felt a mix of anxiety and exhilaration. I could feel eyes turning toward me, faces lighting up in surprise and curiosity. Some hadn't seen me in months, and I could sense the unspoken questions in their gazes. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and held my head high. To my surprise, James was there. I hadn't expected him to be, but there he was, standing across the room, the glass in his hand, looking almost as shocked as I felt. Our eyes met, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of something in his expression, regret, perhaps, or guilt. But instead of feeling the pang of hurt I might have felt in the past, I felt nothing. Just a calm, steady resolve. As the evening went on, I found myself surrounded by friends, people who had known me before James, people who had watched me grow and change over the years. They asked me about my art, about my new interests, genuinely curious about the life I was building for myself. I could feel their support, their admiration, and it bolstered my spirit, reminding me of the person I had once been, the person I was becoming again. At one point, a friend approached me with a warm smile and said, "You seem different, stronger somehow." Her words struck a chord, resonating with the journey I had been on, the countless nights of self-reflection, the battles I had fought in silence. I thanked her, my voice steady, realizing that I truly did feel stronger. I was no longer the woman who would stand by in silence, who would sacrifice her worth for someone who didn't value her. And then, almost as if by some unseen force, I found myself standing across from James. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of shock and something else, something that seemed almost like envy, as if he could sense the strength I had gained, the freedom I had found. He opened his mouth, perhaps to speak, but I held up a hand, stopping him. "There's nothing you can say," I said softly, my voice carrying a quiet conviction. "Nothing you say will change what happened or what I've learned about myself. You made your choice that night, and I made mine." He looked away, a shadow of shame crossing his face. I could see the weight of his guilt, the burden of knowing he had lost something he would never regain. But I didn't feel satisfaction or triumph. All I felt was a sense of peace, a calm that came from knowing I had finally freed myself from the chains of his betrayal. As I turned to walk away, I could feel the weight of the past lifting from my shoulders, replaced by a newfound confidence. I was no longer the woman who would shrink in his presence, who would bend over backward to make him happy. I was standing tall, independent, whole. The room around me seemed to buzz with a new energy, one that mirrored the strength I felt within myself. Friends came up to me, smiling, patting my shoulder, their silent support enveloping me like a warm embrace. I could see the admiration in their eyes, a reflection of the journey I had taken, the battles I had fought and won. I realized in that moment that I wasn't just reclaiming my life, I was stepping into a new one, a life defined by my own terms, my own choices, my own worth. And as I left that gathering, walking out into the night, I felt a sense of freedom unlike anything I had ever known. I was no longer haunted by his choices or the memories of that night. I had let go, truly let go, and in doing so I had found something priceless, a sense of self, a strength that could never be taken away. For the first time in years, I felt whole, complete, and entirely myself. I had faced the shadows of my past, confronted the pain and betrayal, and come out on the other side, stronger and more resilient than ever. This was my victory, my story, and I knew that from this moment on, I would live my life fully, boldly, without fear or doubt. Walking away from that gathering, I felt as though I were stepping into a new world, one where I was no longer bound by the weight of the past, no longer defined by someone else's choices. For the first time, I was free, truly free, to live my life the way I wanted. The world felt bigger, brighter, filled with possibilities that had once seemed beyond my reach. In the days that followed, I settled into a rhythm that felt entirely my own. Each morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet joy that came from knowing I was living life on my own terms. My days were filled with the things I loved: painting, reconnecting with friends, exploring new hobbies, and, most importantly, learning to be comfortable with myself. The quiet of my small apartment became a sanctuary, a space where I could reflect, grow, and rediscover the parts of myself I had once lost. I spent hours painting, letting my emotions flow onto the canvas. With each stroke, I felt a piece of my old self returning, a version of me that had been silenced for far too long. My art became a testament to my journey, a visual representation of the strength and resilience I had found within myself. And it wasn't just art. I took up running, something I'd never thought I would enjoy, but now found strangely liberating. There was something empowering about feeling the ground beneath my feet, the rhythm of my breath, the steady pounding of my heart. Each mile was a reminder that I was capable, strong, and able to move forward on my own. As I continued to explore my new life, I found myself reconnecting with old dreams, the ambitions and goals I had set aside years ago. I started taking classes, learning new skills that excited and challenged me. It was exhilarating to dive into the unknown, to pursue interests that were purely my own, without worrying about someone else's approval or expectations. One evening, as I sat by the window in my apartment, watching the city lights flicker against the dark sky, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. The silence, once so daunting, now felt comforting, a gentle reminder of the freedom I had claimed. I realized that I didn't need anyone else to complete me, to make me feel whole. I was enough for myself, enough for the life I was building. There were moments, of course, when memories of the past would resurface, unbidden. I'd think of James, of the life we had shared, of the dreams we had once built together. But each time the pain felt a little less sharp, the memories a little less vivid. I had forgiven him, not for his sake, but for my own peace. I had let go of the anger, the resentment, the hurt, knowing that they no longer served me. They were remnants of a life that no longer held any place in my heart. As the weeks turned into months, I began to notice a shift within myself. I was no longer defined by the pain of the past, no longer held back by the ghosts of what had been. Instead, I was embracing the future, a future filled with possibilities, with dreams that were entirely my own. I felt lighter, freer, as though a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. And then, one day, I realized that I was truly happy. Not the fleeting happiness that comes from external validation, but a deep, enduring happiness that came from within. I had built a life that was mine, a life that reflected my values, my passions, my dreams. I was surrounded by people who genuinely cared for me, who valued me for who I was, not for what I could do for them. I no longer felt the need to prove myself, to earn someone else's love or approval. I had found something far more precious, a sense of self-worth, a belief in my own strength and resilience. I had learned that my value didn't come from anyone else's love or validation. It came from within, from the knowledge that I had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, wiser, and more whole than ever before. One night, as I sat with a group of friends, laughing and sharing stories, I felt a surge of gratitude wash over me. Gratitude for the journey I had taken, for the lessons I had learned, for the strength I had discovered within myself. I realized that I was no longer haunted by the past. It was a part of my story, yes, but it no longer defined me. I had moved beyond it, creating a new story, one that was filled with hope, with love, and with a deep appreciation for the life I was building. As I walked home that evening, I felt a quiet thrill, a sense of excitement for all that lay ahead. I knew there would be challenges, moments of doubt, but I also knew that I was strong enough to face them. I had proven that to myself, time and time again. I had found my voice, my worth, my strength, and I was ready to embrace whatever the future held. With each step, I felt a sense of closure, a final letting go of the past. I had walked through the fire and come out the other side, whole and unscathed. And as I looked up at the stars, I whispered a silent promise to myself. A promise to live fully, to love freely, and to never settle for anything less than I deserved. This was my new beginning, my chance to create a life that celebrated who I was and who I was becoming. I was no longer defined by anyone else's choices. I was free, truly free, to live a life that was entirely, beautifully, and unapologetically my own. I had always thought that heartbreak would be the end of me, that somehow the pain would hollow me out, leaving me empty, unable to move forward. But here I was, standing stronger than ever, with a new sense of purpose and a quiet strength that pulsed through every step I took. I was no longer a shadow of someone else's life. I was building my own, one day, one choice at a time. Over the weeks, I found myself more in love with the life I was creating. I woke up each morning with a renewed sense of possibility, a calm knowing that whatever came my way, I could handle it. I had been through fire and come out whole. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because I refused to let that hurt define me. I started volunteering, connecting with people who were also trying to find their way. Each person I met had their own story, their own scars, and in listening to them, I felt a sense of solidarity. There was something powerful in helping others heal, in giving back what I had learned. My pain had taught me compassion, and with each act of kindness, I felt my own heart mend, piece by piece. One evening, as I walked home, I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. Gratitude for the struggle, for the lessons, even for the heartache that had once seemed unbearable. I realized that my story wasn't just about loss. It was about transformation, about the strength it takes to let go of what no longer serves us, to step forward into the unknown, trusting that there is something better waiting. In moments of reflection, I thought about him, about the life we had shared, the dreams we had built together. But I no longer felt bitterness, no longer felt the need to question or understand his choices. I saw him as a chapter in my story, a chapter that had shaped me, that had taught me the importance of choosing myself. And for that, I felt a kind of peace, a peace I never thought I'd find. When people asked about him or what had happened, I simply smiled. I didn't need to explain or defend my choices anymore. My life spoke for itself, filled with joy, with purpose, with the freedom to be exactly who I was meant to be. I didn't need validation, didn't need anyone's approval. I had found something far more precious: self-worth. With every passing day, I felt my vision for the future crystallize. I dreamed of traveling, of starting projects that would make a difference, of living with purpose. But more than anything, I dreamed of a life filled with meaning, a life that I had built on my own terms. I wanted to live boldly, without regrets, embracing every moment, every opportunity. As I stood at the edge of this new chapter, I felt a quiet thrill, a surge of excitement for all that was to come. I had been tested, broken, but never defeated. And now, as I looked forward, I felt a kind of wholeness, a strength that ran deeper than I'd ever known. I whispered a silent promise to myself, to live fully, to love freely, to never settle for anything less than I deserved. Because I'd learned that true happiness doesn't come from someone else's love, but from the love we have for ourselves. This was my story, and I was finally ready to live it, boldly, unapologetically, and with a heart that was stronger, wiser, and open to all the beauty that life had to offer. With each passing day, I felt more connected to the person I was becoming, a version of myself that felt both familiar and new. I had learned to stand on my own, to live for myself, to embrace the freedom that came with being truly independent. And as time went on, I began to discover a deeper joy, a joy rooted in the simple, unassuming parts of life that I had once overlooked. I started making plans that were purely for me, plans that filled me with excitement and curiosity. I traveled to places I'd only dreamed of visiting, each destination a fresh canvas for my new life. I spent afternoons wandering through quiet streets, soaking in the sights, sounds, and stories of people and places I had never known. I felt as though I were collecting pieces of the world, each one filling a part of me that I hadn't realized was missing. One evening, as I watched the sunset over a city I'd never been to before, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the journey, for the heartbreak, for every tear and every lesson. Without those moments, I might never have found this path, this peace that now filled my life. The past was no longer a weight, it was a stepping stone, a part of my story that had led me to this very moment. In my travels, I met people who, like me, were rebuilding, rediscovering themselves after loss, betrayal, or heartache. We shared our stories, finding comfort in the common threads that connected us. It was in those conversations, those shared moments of vulnerability, that I realized just how universal the journey of healing is. We are all, in our own ways, searching for meaning, for peace, for the strength to start anew. One day, I decided to capture my journey in words, to share my story with others who might be struggling, who might be standing at the edge of their own transformation. I wrote down every lesson, every revelation, every moment of doubt, and every breakthrough. It was a cathartic experience, one that allowed me to see just how far I had come. Through sharing my story, I found a new purpose. I wanted others to know that they were not alone, that healing and happiness were possible, even after the deepest wounds. I wanted to remind them that strength is not about never falling, but about rising each time we do. I wanted to show them that they, too, could find their own light, their own path, their own sense of worth. As I put the finishing touches on my story, I felt a sense of fulfillment that I had never known. This journey had brought me full circle, from pain to peace, from heartbreak to healing. I no longer needed anyone else's validation, anyone else's love, to feel complete. I had found everything I needed within myself. In the end, my story wasn't just about loss. It was about growth, resilience, and the incredible power of choosing yourself. I had learned that life doesn't end when someone else walks away. It begins when you find the courage to walk toward yourself. And as I stood at the threshold of my future, I knew that I was ready for whatever came next. Bold, unafraid, and deeply, unapologetically happy. As I look back on everything I've been through, I see the person I was, the one who stayed silent, who sacrificed, who put her needs last, in the hope that love would make it all worth it. And while I feel compassion for that version of myself, I am no longer bound to her choices, her fears, or her doubts. She is a part of my story, but she is not who I am today. Life has a way of teaching us lessons in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes it takes heartache to show us our strength, betrayal to lead us towards self-worth, and loss to remind us of what truly matters. I once believed that my happiness was tied to someone else's love, that my value depended on how much I could give, how much I could endure. But now, I understand that happiness begins within, that true love is found in how we choose to value ourselves. To anyone who might be going through a similar journey, to anyone who feels broken, lost, or unsure of their path, I want you to know this. You are enough. You don't need anyone else's approval to be worthy. You don't need anyone else's love to be whole. You have within you a strength that can overcome any darkness, a light that shines even in the toughest of times. This journey isn't easy. It's filled with moments of doubt, of longing, of wondering if you'll ever feel whole again. But with each step, with each decision to choose yourself, you will find pieces of joy, resilience, and self-discovery waiting for you. You will emerge stronger, wiser, and more in love with the person you are becoming. Remember, your story is yours to write. Let it be a story of courage, of healing, of the fierce and unyielding love you have for yourself. And know that every step forward, no matter how small, is a step toward a life that celebrates you for exactly who you are. As I close this chapter of my life, I am filled with gratitude for the lessons, for the growth, for the strength I never knew I had. And now, as I step forward into a future that is wholly mine, I carry with me a heart that is full, a spirit that is unbreakable, and a soul that is finally beautifully free. This is my story. And now, it's time to live it to the fullest.